All right, so today we're going to dive deep into the case of Robert Sylvester Alston.
Wow.
And, he's this American serial killer. And I know you want to learn more about this case, like
Yeah.
who he was, what he did, and where things stand now. So we're using a document simply titled Robert Sylvester Alston.pdf as our main source. And it really kind of lays out,
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
whole path, right? It's like seemingly normal beginnings and then boom, convicted murderer.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what's striking about this case is that, when you think of a serial killer, you think of this loner lurking in the shadows. But Alston, he had a relatively normal life, at least on the surface. He wasn't completely isolated from society.
Yeah, that's what I think makes it even more unsettling, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with his early life. Alston was born in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1969. Grew up in a family that was described as poor but stable. Not exactly the textbook image of a future serial killer, is it?
Yeah, that's the danger of stereotypes, right? They oversimplify, these complex realities. But the document, it highlights, his introverted nature, his social struggles back in high school. But he also participated in the Reserve Officers Training Corps. I mean, that's a curious juxtaposition, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Do you think that maybe this was an attempt for him to fit in, to kind of project this image of discipline and control that he lacked internally?
That's a fascinating point. Maybe it was a way to overcompensate for his insecurities. After high school, he tried college, but dropped out pretty quickly, moved to Delaware, started a family, had 2 sons. So it seemed like he was trying to build a normal life.
Yeah, and then it's like he abruptly walks away from it all, abandons his partner and children, and then returns to Greensboro. This upheaval, can be a really significant stressor. And while not a direct cause, disruptions like that, sometimes they can be a precursor to destructive behaviors.
Okay, so this brings us closer to the timeline of his crimes. Alston's confirmed murders took place in Greensboro between 1991 and 1993. And his first victim was 23-year-old Joanne Robinson.
And Joanne was struggling with addiction, involved in prostitution. And that's a pattern we see with several of Alston's victims, which raises the question, were these women targeted because their circumstances made them seem less likely to be missed, or because Alston perceived them as easier targets?
It's a chilling thought. He strangled Joanne, and her body was found not far from where he lived.
Yeah, and the proximity of his residence to these discovery sites is a detail that I think is worth noting. I mean, it suggests either a lack of planning, a sense of impunity, or perhaps even a twisted desire to have his crimes discovered.
And with his second victim, Sharon Martin, the brutality just escalates. He strangled her, but then he dismembered her body, scattered her remains around Greensboro. Her severed head and hand were found near a middle school. Can you talk about the psychology behind dismemberment in these cases?
So dismemberment is often more than just an act of violence. It's symbolic, right?
Yeah.
For some perpetrators. It's about dehumanizing the victim, making them less of a person in their minds. It can also be a way to exert control, to kind of dominate not just the victim in life, but also in death. And then, practically speaking, it's often a way to hinder identification and to delay the investigation.
So it's both a psychological and strategic act. Alston's third confirmed victim was Shemika Warren, also involved in prostitution and suffering from drug addiction. And her naked and decapitated body was found in a vacant lot, again, close to Alston's home.
It's like he was operating within this comfort zone, right? This radius of control. I mean, this lack of effort to conceal the bodies, it speaks volumes, doesn't it? Almost an arrogance.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's Lois Elizabeth Williams, his last confirmed victim. He raped and strangled her.
Yeah.
And left her body in a cemetery. Like the others, she had fallen into prostitution and drug use after a period of job loss.
That detail about her past, it's really important because it underscores the fact that these women, they weren't always defined by their struggles, right? They had lives, they had histories, they had aspirations. And while their circumstances made them vulnerable, it's crucial to remember that they were victims, not statistics.
Absolutely. Now, this is where things take an even darker turn. So in early 1994, Alston picked up a 29-year-old hitchhiker, drove her to a secluded area, brutally assaulted and raped her, tried to strangle her,
Yeah.
and then he threw her off a bridge into a river.
This attack, thankfully, didn't end in another murder. The victim survived. And her bravery in reporting the crime, providing a description of her attacker. That was key to Alston's capture.
Yeah, it really highlights the importance of survivors coming forward no matter how difficult it might be. Her description led police to create a facial composite, and Alston was identified from a mugshot lineup. Now, he didn't have any prior arrests, but he had been questioned previously as a suspect. because he was living near where some of the victims were found.
And here's a turning point in the investigation. So Alston was initially arrested for the attack on the hitchhiker, but shortly after, he confessed to the murder of Lois Elizabeth Williams. Why do you think that happened? Was it a way to relieve guilt, or was there, a more calculated motive behind this sudden confession?
It's hard to say for sure, maybe a bit of both. But
Okay.
one thing's for sure, this confession, it kind of opens the floodgates.
Right. It's a common pattern with, serial offenders.
Mm,
Once they admit to one crime, the barrier to admitting to others seems to crumble, perhaps a twisted form of catharsis, or even a desire for notoriety.
yeah. In 1996, he confessed to the murder of Joanne Robinson. And then in 1998, he admitted to the murders of Sharon Martin and Shamika Warren. But even with these confessions, there's this chilling lack of remorse. In his demeanor, he even smiled. While describing his crimes during sentencing,
His refusal to reveal the location of some of the remains is particularly disturbing. It suggests this desire to maintain, a degree of control, even from behind bars, like a way to continue tormenting the families of his victims, denying them closure. And then there's the strange detail of authorities believing he anonymously tipped them off about the location of some remains. He denied it, of course.
oh man, that's just messed up, isn't it? It's almost like he's playing a game trying to manipulate the situation,
Mm.
even after being caught. So that brings us to the end of this chapter of Alston's story. He's currently serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. At the Columbus Correctional Institution in North Carolina, he's been convicted of 4 murders, but there are strong suspicions he may be responsible for at least 2 more.
And those suspicions aren't just coming from law enforcement. Alston himself has hinted at being involved in more murders than he's been charged with. So we'll delve into those unresolved questions and try to understand the psychology behind his actions. In part 2 of our deep dive. Welcome back.
So what stood out to you so far about Alston's case? What's been, the most striking thing to you?
Honestly, it's those it's those lingering questions, right? The ones that keep kind of swirling in my mind. Like, we know he's strongly suspected in the murders of Denise Robinson and Cheryl Lynn Mason back in Greensboro during the same period as his confirmed victims. But he's never charged, due to lack of evidence. I mean, how often do you think that happens? Where investigators think they have the right guy, but they just can't prove it. More often than you might think. And it's really frustrating for everyone involved, especially the families of the victims, because they're left wondering, will they ever get true justice? And in Alston's case, it's not just speculation. He's actually suggested in interviews that he's responsible for more than just the 4 murders he was convicted of.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
chilling to think about. Like, there might be other families out there still searching for answers, unaware that the person responsible is already, behind bars. It's like, it just adds another layer of tragedy to this already horrific situation.
Absolutely. It makes you realize that, the official case files, they often only tell part of the story. There's this human cost to these crimes that goes so far beyond the statistics and the legal proceeding.
Yeah.
But this brings us to the question that always seems to loom large in these cases. Why? What could possibly drive someone to commit such horrific acts?
Right. I mean, it's easy to just dismiss someone like Alston as,
Yeah.
evil, but that feels too simplistic, too easy. There has to be more to it than that, right?
You're right. Attributing it solely to, evil, it doesn't really help us understand the underlying motivations. With serial killers, there's rarely a single clear-cut explanation. It's often this complex mix of psychological factors, personal experiences, and even biological predispositions.
Our source material, it doesn't go too deep into Alston's psychology. But there are some clues that we can look at, like his social struggles in high school, his failed attempt at college, abandoning his family. All of that kind of suggests someone who's carcely, grappling with feelings of inadequacy and alienation. Wouldn't you say?
Those are definitely factors worth considering. And when you combine those feelings with, a potential lack of empathy, a distorted sense of power and control, it creates this dangerous combination. But it's important to remember that, we're speculating here based on limited information.
Of course. We're not trying to, diagnose Alston from afar. But it does seem like these recurring patterns in serial killer profiles, they're worth examining. Like, maybe by understanding these common threads, we can get closer to preventing these tragedies from happening in the first place.
Exactly. And that's what makes these deep dives so crucial. It's not just about satisfying some morbid curiosity. It's about gaining this deeper understanding of the darkness that exists within the human psyche so we can better address it.
Now, I want to bring up something Alston said in a 2016 interview that I found particularly disturbing. He said, and I'm quoting here, I don't see myself as a serial killer, but people do. How do you interpret a statement like that?
Well, that's a fascinating and honestly quite chilling example of the psychological defense mechanisms
Mm.
that some serial offenders employ. It's a form of denial, right? A way to distance themselves
Yeah.
from the horrific nature of their actions and the label that society has placed upon them. But it raises a lot of questions too, doesn't it? Like, is he truly incapable of understanding the gravity of his crimes? Or is it this calculated attempt to manipulate public perception?
Hmm. I'm kind of leaning towards the former. It
Yeah.
seems like a classic case of cognitive dissonance. Like he's built up this internal narrative to justify his actions, to protect his own ego.
Yeah.
But the reality is, he took the lives of 4 innocent women, and potentially more. And the impact of those crimes, it's going to reverberate for generations.
But it's a key point. We can't forget about the ripple effect of these crimes. The victims' families, their friends, the entire community of Greensboro, they all carry the scars of Alston's actions. And that's something we need to explore further.
We've spent a lot of time, delving into the details of Alston's crimes, trying to understand, like, the psychological factors, right? But like you mentioned at the end of part 2, we can't overlook the wider impact of his actions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's like this ripple effect, you know? It extends far beyond the immediate victims, families, communities, even society as a whole.
So let's talk about Greensboro, North Carolina. This is where he was born and raised, and where he ultimately returned to commit these acts. I can only imagine, like, the fear and anxiety that gripped the community during that time.
Absolutely. The discovery of those bodies.
Yeah.
Especially the dismembered remains, right? It created this palpable sense of vulnerability. People were afraid to walk alone at night, afraid for their children, you know. It's a trauma that can linger for years, even decades.
And for the families of the victims, the pain is immeasurable. They're left to grieve. But also, they're grappling with these unanswered questions, the lack of closure.
Yeah, it's a profound injustice. And it really highlights the need for ongoing support and resources for these families. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's also about healing and restoration.
Alston's case, it raises a lot of questions about the nature of evil and, how we can even prevent these kinds of tragedies. But it also kind of sheds light on some important aspects of serial killers that often get overlooked. Like,
Yeah.
he wasn't the stereotypical loner, the isolated and reclusive figure that we often see portrayed in movies and TV shows.
Right, that's a crucial point. Alston had a family, held jobs, interacted with people on a regular basis. He was, to some extent, integrated into his community. And this really challenges that misconception that we can easily identify these individuals based on their outward appearance or social behavior.
It's a sobering reminder that these predators often blend in, appearing ordinary and unassuming, which makes their crimes all the more shocking. When they're finally revealed,
And his case also highlights the complexities of law enforcement and the challenges of actually bringing these offenders to justice. It took the bravery of a surviving victim to finally break the case open.
makes you realize that.
Yeah.
Even with dedicated investigators and, advanced forensic techniques, there's still an element of chance, human error, that can influence these investigations.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to have these open and honest conversations,
Yeah.
right, about the limitations of the justice system, but also acknowledging the hard work and dedication of those who are fighting to keep us safe.
This deep dive has been quite a journey, huh?
Yeah.
From the shock and horror of his crimes to try and understand his motivations and the wider implications for society. What's the key takeaway you want our listener to ponder?
Well, we've explored the who, the what, and the where of Robert Sylvester Alston's case. But the most profound question, the one that continues to fascinate and frustrate criminologists and psychologists, is the why. What truly compels someone to take another human life? Not just once, but repeatedly. It's a question worth pondering, not for morbid curiosity, but for the hope that, by understanding these dark impulses, we might one day be able to prevent them.
That's a powerful thought to leave our listener with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the disturbing case of Robert Sylvester Alston. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.